Okay, so
So
going,
then the final thing is sort
yeah.
of the catch-all, the other, you want to be able, since you're trying to have a single document, you want to capture what other centralized groups are doing. Uh, you have to be a little bit careful as far as, the regulations about, tipping and confidentiality or whatever. So, SAR information itself would probably have to be sanitized. But you do want to know about transaction monitoring at a high level, what sort of
Right.
rejections you're getting and screening. Obviously, you want to know about negative news, that sort of thing. So while you need to be careful that you're not crossing any, you know, borders as far as disclosing information, you do want to make sure that you know what's happening with the other groups that have
Mm,
been delegated certain responsibilities so that you can make an informed assessment uh, uh, of that work and kind of what is telling you about the customers. Uh, and the other thing is it was very, very important to us that we talk about the formatting of issues, and so you'd pick that up as well. Uh, so let's see here.
sure.
On the negative news, that's a good area to talk about. It was
Hmm.
formatting. I didn't want people to just like reprint the article. I wanted you to tell me like what sort of topic are you talking about, a corruption issue or a sanctions issue or whatever? Is this a new issue or is it an ongoing story? What's the amount of money that's involved? What's the source that we're relying it on? Is this playing out in the Wall Street Journal or is it just an emerging issue? Uh,
Right.
what is our customer doing to mitigate this? Do I have a situation where it's under control and, maybe they did make a mistake, but they've shut down that line of business or they've let the people go, or, whatever? Or am I looking at the tip of an iceberg that's going to only get worse? Uh, it's very, very important when you're dealing with this that you're keeping it actionable for the decision maker. Uh,
Mm,
and what I found was by having, sort of a prescribed way of presenting it, people couldn't just draft their way around it or kind of hide the issue. If you had to say like, what's the credibility of the source or what's the materiality, that forced you to think about it and then take a stand. Like I said, one of the complaints I had when we changed this approach was, our line people that were doing it were saying, well, geez, this is hard, this is making us think. And I said, well, that's intentional. We
yeah.
want everyone in the process to be thinking. And there was more than a few times that I might disagree with someone on the reliability of the source or materiality or whatever, but I wanted to know what their point of view was before I came to my own opinion.
Right.
And the other thing is, and this was in the the other was, you know, they wanted to have some sense of the revenue. And the idea wasn't so much that profitability or revenue would ever justify retaining a bad risk. I mean, there was
Hmm.
zero tolerance for that. Well, there was kind of a concern that I think is well placed, which is you wanted to make sure that there was enough revenue there that people would do the things they were supposed to do and not cut corners.
Mm,
And if you don't have, a certain base level of revenue or profitability or whatever, so that you can do all the stuff that you're supposed to do,
yeah.
and you drift into cutting corners, it's best if you deal with that head on. Uh, it's too easy if you ignore the revenue to drift into the cutting the corners. And if you have
Absolutely.
someone that's not making much money or whatever, then you
Mm,
got to ask your question, well, you know, by retaining this customer, am I cutting corners?
yeah, exactly. And then that's absolutely a great point, I think, for everyone, because not many organizations really invest on finding out this kind of information, really, which is absolutely important for the decision making.
Now, there is a flip side of that, and it's a flip side I've been spending a lot of time on over the last couple of years, which is financial inclusion.
Mm,
And a lot of banks have closed, a lot of large US dollar clearers have closed accounts because of the revenue and profitability. And, I can understand that. And it's well recognized, even, at the government level. Uh, but I think there's some workarounds, like with looking at, you know, uh, highly distributed activity, or, real people doing real things transparently, or that sort of thing, where you can recognize the low risk stuff without as much of an effort. And what I have found, and I think I've got a pretty good basis for doing this because of the amount of time I've spent with activity, is most of your activity through the emerging markets uh, tends to be highly distributed and pretty low risk from an AML perspective.
mm,
Uh, and so you can use the same metrics for the low risk for financial inclusion. And there's some other things you can do. You can maybe have, what I would call healthy downstreaming, where you would have large regional banks, that would have customers in those countries, and it makes sense, that they would follow those customers and deal with, the local banks there to help their own customers or whatever. And you could have more of a healthy downstream type joint underwriting, where you have three parties rather than just one. You have your core, main US dollar clearer, you have your regional clearer that may be doing the bulk of the work, and then you have your respondent bank at the very bottom. But it is an area that people are going to have to think through. And if we're continuing down this road of, people being cut off because of lack of profitability, eventually our central bank, the Federal Reserve, is going to have to work with the central banks of these countries that are getting de-risked, and come up with clearer of last resort type solutions. A lot to deal with there, but in my mind, we all need to deal with the financial inclusion issue every bit as much as we deal with the risk issue. The good news is, in my mind, the low risk overlaps almost 100% with the financial inclusion, and it's pretty easy to quantify and monitor it. So, as long as people are changing, their approach and getting away from checklists and alerts and stuff like that, and looking more at the customer base, who do you bank, who don't you bank, and how do you tell the difference? It's a very solvable problem, but it does require a huge mindset change, both within the banks themselves, but also with the regulators.
absolutely great points, Tom. And I think that I can remember, many of the great points that you've just mentioned, because, these were absolutely, um, these topics came up as we worked, during our last, working place. And I think that many times when we don't understand the risk, we tend to uh, put everybody on high alert, and that kind of increases the cost factor that you were just mentioning about, where when the cost goes up, of course the revenue goes down. And so I think understanding is very, very important. And you also mentioned that mostly these are benign, and if you don't understand the benign risk, then you don't understand what is not benign. And I think these are absolutely extremely important point for everybody.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And, you know, it is, you know, you were talking about the country reports earlier. You know, one of the things I insisted on, and it just came naturally, is before you ever get to the risk of the country, you have to understand the economics of the country and what type of flows are expected and that sort of thing. And in the countries that are getting de-risked, almost always you have real people doing real things transparently. Ironically, those files tend to be among the most transparent. So the ones that are the least transparent are, you know, the large offshore financial centers like Switzerland or the US or things like that. So uh, I absolutely think that if you change the mindset and you focus more on, you know, what is the benign activity,
Yeah,
you'll get to a solution. And quite frankly, I think it'll be substantially cheaper than where we are now. Uh,
exactly. And
you know,
and
we
your
we self-inflict a lot of these costs on ourselves,
yeah,
and we add a lot of noise because of what we're doing.
yeah, absolutely. And your point on financial inclusion, which is a great it's a very important topic these days because I think that it's very important to understand who we are dealing with and who we are not dealing with. Just by exiting doesn't mean that we are mitigating. So, because, nothing is in silo anymore. I mean, you cannot really insulate yourself by exiting. So I think these are great points and absolutely
Yeah,
very,
no, I would agree with that, and I would add this, which is, okay, if one bank exits, you know, maybe another bank, you know, steps in, maybe it doesn't. You know, if it steps in, you really haven't reduced the overall risk of that activity. If no one steps in and you've cut that respondent bank off from the global um, thing, then you're moving the activity to less regulated areas,
mhm,
not bank financial institutions, that sort of thing. You're moving it perhaps into other currencies.
yeah,
Uh, you know, you're making it certainly less transparent. You know, I remember having a discussion with a colleague that was very involved with the RMA process, and he said, you know, if you cut off the you know, the direct accounts, you know, then you have it kind of going through the RMAs, and it's less easy to watch. And then
yeah,
if you cut off the RMAs, uh, you know, then you're making it even less transparent. So
yeah,
uh, you're actually having like very destructive um, impact on the overall risk of global um,
yeah,
flows. I mean, what you
exactly.
want is real people doing real things transparently. Exiting accounts on a global basis cuts off the real people doing real things, and it totally destroys transparency.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember your point on sanctions that, how you compared it with whack-a-mole, the game. And it's so related, and I think that this is also relevant here because when you exit, not necessarily they're really going away. They may come or they may have different way of engaging with you. I think that it's always better to keep them and monitor them and treating them with suitable sort of risk appetite instead of just cutting them.
Well, I agree with that up to a point. And that point is at some point, if your risk appetite between the correspondent and the respondent doesn't agree, then you have to exit.
Yeah.
Um, I mean,
Mhm.
you know, at the end of the day, every correspondent bank needs to make its own decision. You
Sure.
know, they can consider these type of factors or whatever, but and we'll talk about it in the risk decisions
Sure.
on the remediation and that sort of thing. And I think there's some really strong intermediate steps you can do. But if you get to a point where you say our risk appetites just don't agree,
Yeah.
no amount of monitoring or discussions or paper documentation is going to mask that.
Yeah.
So now
That's
that
very true.
when we get to the risk decision stuff, We'll
Okay.
spend a lot about how you can, get the risk appetites to align. And, I think all banks need to spend a lot more time on that, is
Hmm.
getting, you know, the risk appetites aligned. And that's sort of the intermediate ground between accepting the risk or rejecting it, which is you both change and get more of a mutual risk appetite. And I think that's one of the directions that correspondent banking needs to move in.
Yes, great. Thanks.